Hello and welcome to another lecture of Econ 2301, Principles of Macroeconomics. This lecture will cover Chapter 8, Why Do Economies Grow? In this lecture we will look at the growth rate, why it's important, and how are some ways in which we can grow the economy. If you'll recall from Chapter 7 as well as Chapter 6, we want the economy to grow because that helps us maintain our lifestyle. I don't know about you, but I'm very comfortable with indoor plumbing. I would hate for us to not experience growth in which I would have to revert back to an outhouse or no plumbing at all. So let's look at some ways in which we can increase economic growth or lead to positive growth rates. First, let's look at capital deepening. What is capital deepening? Well, it's an increase of stock of capital per worker. If you'll recall from Chapter 7, the stock of capital is one of the production functions or the functions of production when we have the economy as a whole. Physical capital and natural resources all get piled into the stock of capital. So as we build more buildings, say school buildings, fire stations, libraries, things like that, we're increasing the stock of capital. The more machines we have, equipment, etc. This leads to an increase in output. However, if you'll recall from Chapter 7, we also at some point will experience a diminishing returns on capital deepening. In other words, output at some point will increase at a decreasing rate. What this means is we can't just keep building after building after building and expect to get the same production output that we got before. For example, if we had a school building and we built another one because this one school building couldn't hold all the children, it would be very ignorant and really stupid of us to go ahead and build 3 or 4 school buildings, especially if we didn't fill up both of the 2 first initial school buildings. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we'll have more students. It just means that more students are able to go to school and have a comfortable setting. But as we keep adding more and more buildings, we won't get the same output of students. Technological progress. More efficient ways of organizing affairs that allow to an economic increase of output without increasing inputs. What a great way this is, because this means we don't have to necessarily continually pay for the progress. In other words, if I buy a computer and it makes me more efficient, I don't have to keep buying that same computer. If I have an automated telephone system, I no longer have to pay a receptionist to transfer calls. From then on, all I do is answer my phone. My phone is paid for, it's a sunk cost initially, but afterward, I am able to be more productive. And one of the greatest things about technological progress is that it lowers overall prices. Think of it this way. If we had a worker working at, let's just say, McDonald's or Taco Bell, and they were in charge of making sure the fries or tacos or you name it did not get burnt, and they had to just keep their eye on that. If we replaced them with a machine in which could time the amount of time that the food cooked, we would no longer have to pay that employee. Because of this, we can actually lower the price of our goods. We can lower the price of food that we sell at. This will lead to an increase in overall real wages. As we increase our real wages, we see a money multiplier effect. We can buy various other goods by having more money or wealth from a decrease in the original price of other goods or the initial good. Finally, human capital. This is the knowledge and skills required through working and education. You will recall that as a factor of production from one of the first chapters. what we can do is increase our overall human capital as a nation, and this will lead to economic growth. Now, in the short term, this is very expensive. If you think about it, anytime children go to school from ages 6 to, let's say, 18, as is in the United States, they are not working, they're not part of the labor force. They're also taking away money that is revenue that the government has collected. In the United States, education is free. Well, to an extent. Right now, I'm paying taxes in Plainview High School's district. There are a lot of students at Plainview High School in which I pay for some of their education. Now, I don't have any children that are even close to elementary, let alone high school. But why am I willing to do this? Well, because it increases the overall human capital of the whole nation. Hopefully that they will learn the skills needed to be better workers, more productive, and as they earn more wages, they will also pay more in tax revenue. For example, if I had a worker who was earning $20,000 a year, working, let's say, at a fast food restaurant, they paid 10% of their salary in taxes. Let's say that the tax rate was exactly the same for a worker earning $100,000. They're an engineer making $100,000 a year, and they're paying 10%. Well, the worker only making $20,000 a year will pay $2,000 of their income in taxes, versus the worker who makes $100,000 a year, they'll pay $10,000. Now, I don't want to get into the semantics of whether the flat tax is appropriate or progressive tax is appropriate. What I want you to see is that if the whole workforce earns more money, there will be more revenue just based on the fact of large numbers. So what happens to economic growth as we see this in play? And if you look at the production possibilities curve, now you don't need to know this for the exam, it's just to show you what happens as we produce various goods. Now let's say we're in an economy that only produces two goods, and this is one of the reasons why I don't really prefer this curve, because it really isn't a good example of a nation. Rarely would we choose between only military goods and consumer goods, but let's just say for this example we are going to have these two only. Well, what I know is that if I chose this point right here to produce military goods and consumer goods, this is the max amount, given that resources are scarce, that I can produce. I would hit that point of consumer goods, and I'd hit this point of military goods. If I were to increase productivity either by capital deepening or education or technology, I see a growth that goes out to this point right here. It's parallel to this. It's not straight up because it's parallel, and it would be this point right there. And if I go down and intersect, sorry that my line's not straight, if I intersect C2, and for this example we'll call this M2, you'll see that both increased. Now they may be the exact, actually they will be the exact same percentage. If I were to draw a line right here down the middle where it connected both lines, the percentage up here on the top of the curve would be the same in both cases, as well as here. So measuring economic growth. Well, we like to look at real GDP, and the reason why is because it's adjusted for prices. Remember, if GDP just increases and prices increase likewise or correspondingly, then I don't necessarily have more money, or my wealth isn't increased, or my lifestyle isn't any better. However, if real GDP increases, which means that price levels either stay the same or decrease, I actually have more money. Now, what we like to do is take the real GDP in every nation and divide it out by the amount of people or population of that nation so we get a real GDP per capita. This tells us a lot. A lot of people have told me that they're worried about China overtaking the United States as an economic power. One thing that they're forgetting to account for is the fact that there are 1 billion Chinese. When you take that into account, you have to divide out their real GDP by the amount of population they have. Their real GDP per capita isn't anywhere near the United States. Likewise, small countries such as in the European Union, like Sweden, Germany, not even Germany, maybe smaller like Hungary and those countries, they can see a drastically high real GDP per capita, even though their real GDP is not necessarily that big. To put it in more micro terms, to give you a better understanding, or maybe a visual understanding, think of it this way. If I had a family of 20, such as the Duggars or Diggers, I don't know, I don't watch that show, but let's just say I had a huge family. I had 18 mouths to feed plus my wife and mine, so a total of 20, and I'm making $100,000 a year. That's pretty good, right? What if I was making $75,000 a year and I only had 2 children? 4 people. Well, I would know that life was much, much better making $75,000, my real income per capita, if you want to put it that way. My dollar extends much further when I have less mouths to feed. That's kind of common sense, but we need to find out the real GDP per capita in order to compare two countries. Now you'll recall from the first section I had you perform growth rates and actually work out these equations. The reason was, and you're probably wondering why we're just now seeing it again or for the first time in a slide, it's because I wanted you to get comfortable enough with the growth rate formula, because we're going to have more formulas this chapter as well as this section, that you're not going to be overwhelmed. You need to know the unemployment rate, which we covered in last chapter, chapter 7, which is simply the unemployed divided by the labor force. You also need to know what the labor force equation is, as well as the labor force participation rate, all of which you can find in chapter 7. So you should be very familiar with the growth rate, GDP growth rate. It's fairly simple. GDP in year 2 minus GDP in year 1 divided by GDP in year 1. Now I'm going to do another whiteboard in which I show you how to work out all of these equations. I strongly encourage you to watch it over and over so that you familiarize yourself with it and you aren't looking it up during the exam. I know that the exam, if you're taking it at your computer, you will be able to use your notes, but still know that it will be difficult if you're not familiar with it to calculate it. So the growth rate, once we have the growth rate, we can actually figure out what our GDP will be in the future as long as we sustain that growth rate. For example, let's say that my growth rate was 4%. Well, GDP in years later, let's say 20 years later, that would equal 1 plus the growth rate, 4%, so 0.04, to the nth power times, or to the 20th power times 100. Essentially what it would be, I think, is 2.19 times 100, or 219%. So if my growth rate was 100 million in the first year, 20 years from now, sustaining a growth rate of 4%, if my total GDP was 100 million, sustaining 4%, ceteris paribus, I would have $219 million in GDP. This is very good for us as economists as well as politicians, to figure out what's going to happen over the next 20, 30 years. Now, this is all estimation because we don't know whether the economy will constantly grow at that rate or not, but it gives us a better idea of what to expect. Remember the anticipated inflation? Well, this is kind of where we start calculating and applying that into economic policy. So what is the rule of 70? Well, this is actually a pretty neat rule. You might want to use this for yourself as you invest. It's real simple. What it tells us is we take 70 divided by the percentage growth rate, and we get the amount of years it takes to double what we have. So let's just say my growth rate was 4%. If I took 70 divided by, and it's a percentage growth rate, so we actually leave it as a percentage, 70 divided by 4 equals 17.5. In other words, it will take only 17 and a half years for me to double the amount of money I have, or my GDP. Just a quick, simple tip: if your interest rate on your savings account is 1%, that means it's going to take 70 years to double your money. When rates are really good, let's just say they were 10%, unbelievably great rates in the 1980s, if you were to invest then at a 10% rate, it would only take 7 years for you to double your money. Now this kind of shows you various countries and their income or GDP per capita, as well as their growth rate. If you'll notice, the United States is number one, even though we don't necessarily have the highest growth rate. However, we have experienced over the last 48 years a very substantial growth rate considering how big we are. It's real interesting to me because most people wouldn't think the British economy to be that strong or that powerful, but when you divide it out per capita, we see that it's rather close to the United States. Now, if you go all the way down there, you see India and Zimbabwe or Zambia, Nigeria, Pakistan, places like that. These are places in which the government doesn't invest back into the economy. And what I mean by that is not just spending for spending's sake. I mean, they're not building institutions such as education or military or things like that. They're building the minimal amount of capital that's needed. Now, as a classical economist, I believe that the government should be as efficient as possible and therefore as small as possible, but I also believe that by investing in education and human capital, we maintain our growth, and so that's vital. So are poor countries catching up? Well, this is something that's been debated many, many times, and you'll see this graph over there that kind of shows the catch-up and the growth rates if we are to graph them. What you need to know is that convergence is the process by which poor countries close the gap with richer countries in terms of real GDP per capita. If you will look back on the last slide, you saw that Japan was rapidly catching the United States, even though they're far behind in overall real GDP. The per capita, they're getting rather close. A lot of this has to do with the fact that most technology that they're benefiting from has already been invented. If you do not have to go through the trial and error process, let's just say, of inventing the assembly line, electricity, cars, things like that, it takes a lot of time to go through those periods, those industrialization periods. If you're able to just copy someone else, you can close that gap rather quickly. For example, if I gave you all an exam and I had one person try to make 100, and I told them they had 5 tries to make 100, and they turned in their exam 5 times, and each time I gave it back to them with the answers wrong and told them to correct those. Eventually they would probably get 100 right. Then I went to the other class and gave them the same exam and told them that they can ask or copy the first person, and they have 5 tries as well, but they can immediately copy them. They're going to get to 100 much quicker than that first person did. What we see looking at this is that poor countries tend to catch up rather quickly. They have initial income of a lot more as far as in terms of growth. However, over the long run, they hit a wall and essentially start to slow down once they become a developed country. Capital deepening. This is just a graph that kind of shows in terms of the supply of capital what will happen to the production. You'll see that production quickly goes to this point and we see an overall increase. But at the same time, we don't see an increase in labor. So therefore, we're able to increase our overall production without trying to train more people or have more people join the labor force. We're able to do more with much smaller amounts of people or the same amount of people. And you'll also see that it leads to an increase of wages. Okay, saving and investment. A lot of economists, and we'll talk about that in the near future, the Keynesian model don't believe that saving is actual saving. What they say is it's income that is not consumed. And what you're essentially saying is that you are going to use that income eventually someday, and you're going to buy something. Like, for instance, if I save up to buy a car, even though I don't consume today, it's going to be consumption eventually. And so they believe that the equation is C plus S equals Y. And you're not going to need to know this for the exam, but you just need to know how saving equals interest or income. So if my total income is consumption plus saving, then I have consumption plus the income equal or investment. And if I use the transitive property, and if C plus S equals Y and C plus I equals Y, I can substitute them and S equals I, or saving equals investment. This essentially shows you the principle of diminishing returns. What we can do is, by focusing on various things and the way we spend our money as a government, we can either increase total savings or output. However, you'll look at this and see that if the government raises taxes by $100 and the people tend to save 20%, what happens is that while they were saving up maybe at this level, we see a reduction by this much, and this is our total government spending. It's at this level, our government investment, which includes all investment. If we reduce the investment by this much, then we'll have a net total investment decrease of $20 million in this example. So at some point, you can't keep increasing taxes and expect people to save at the same rate. Growth accounting, all you need to know from this is it's a method to determine the contribution to economic growth for increased capital, labor, and technological progress. In other words, what we're saying is that growth could be a function of both capital, labor, and the total accounting from that contribution. So what causes or leads to technological progress? Well, there are a few things. One is research and development. The United States spends more money than anybody else or any other country on research and development. However, when the spending is measured as a percentage of GDP, Japan spends much more. And you can see the various countries and how much they spend on their non-defense and other things. What happens with this, or why this is important, is it shows us how much we're willing to invest in increasing our overall technology or lifestyle. One way that we could be investing in research and development might be new vaccinations, new drugs that make us healthier, a cure for cancer, or education methods. Anytime that we invest in education, that's actually research and development in a way. If we give grants to universities such as Texas Tech in order to develop new ways to dilute water and get out the germs as well as bacteria in order for the water to be safer, things like that, that's all investment in research and development funding. As a percentage of GDP, we don't spend as much as some other countries like Japan. Japan has vastly surpassed us in STEM research, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And that's not a good thing. Monopolies that spur innovation. Essentially, this is creativity destruction. If one firm will try to come up with new products and more efficient ways to produce products to earn monopoly profits, what they're doing essentially is, if I'm the first to be there, if I can maintain a monopoly, even if it's only for a brief period of time, if I invent the iPhone way before anybody else invents a smartphone that's even close to as efficient as well as user-friendly, then I have that monopoly. And having that monopoly, even if it's in a short period of time, leads to a huge increase in my overall profits. And so it can help lead to innovation. What it is also doing is it's making us more competitive to get to that monopolistic state. Now, we don't want that monopoly to be there forever. In fact, we want it to be there for as short a period of time as possible. We want someone to come up with an iPhone and then within a year or a month or even a week come up with a new Galaxy S, whatever you want to call it. Sorry, I'm a Apple geek, so I'm not very familiar with other ones. But the newest Droid or BlackBerry, etc. Adam Smith stressed the size of the market was important for economic development. Remember, he's the godfather, if you will. He's the father of modern economics. What we know is in larger markets, firms have more incentives to come up with new products and new methods of production. The lure of profits, the incentive of having tons of profits, makes it so. I don't know how many times I've heard people say that, the whole search for a cure for cancer is a farce. People are not researching and trying to figure out the cure for cancer because they just want to keep getting millions and millions of government dollars and donations to find the cure. And they're happy making millions of dollars. No offense, but wake up. If you invented the cure for cancer, not only would you be an instant billionaire, you would be probably held as one of the greatest humans to ever live. You would go from being someone who is highly intelligent and probably worth money to being one of the richest persons, if not the richest person in the world, as well as the most known person in the world. So I don't buy that. There is so much profit availability that the global market, because it's a huge market, the scale of the market there, the lure of the profit and the utility from being the man or woman who comes up with the cancer drug, I just don't buy when people say that. It just doesn't make any sense. What causes technological progress? Induced innovation. Some economists have emphasized that innovations come about through incentive activity, essentially induced innovation. For instance, we pay you more because you're smarter, you're an engineer, things like that. Well, what we can do is also give you a scholarship because you're in science or technology or healthcare. The increased knowledge coming from this leads to a high investment in physical capital, such as huge colleges and institutions just for learning engineering and things like that. Education can also enable the workforce in an economy to use its skills to develop new ideas or copy and import them from abroad. You know, it's really funny that people say that the United States needs to be number one in everything. We always need to be number one, right? You've probably heard that over and over and over. And let me tell you something. I'm okay if we're number two. Why not? Why not copy from Japan? You know, they always are ripping us off. Why can't we rip them off and create something cheaper but even better than what they invented? You see, if they go through the process of inventing something and we copy it and make it better, we saved all that time. Remember Convergence? We saved all that time and effort, and all of the resources put into producing that good are almost negated. We can develop things so much faster. The new growth theory essentially tries to explain the origins of technological progress. What they're doing is they're trying to figure out where the technological progress started and where will it go from here as the world becomes more and more flat. And what I mean by that is we see more globalization, we will see more growth because people are allowed to copy from one another. And they're also allowed to choose, remember the division of labor, they're allowed to choose their own career path. In the United States, we have a very free market. I immigrated from Colorado to Texas. I didn't have to pay anything in passport fees or immigration costs. I just moved. Pretty simple, right? Because of that, I was able to take some of the ideas I learned in Colorado, use them here. Now, that may be myopic to think, well, we're the whole United States. Think of it this way. Those who grow and they specialize in cotton, they live right around here, right? Well, can't they trade with people that live in Florida and make oranges? And can't they trade very cheaply and use their knowledge and say, hey, this is what worked on cotton, maybe you should try it on oranges, or vice versa? Much, much easier than if they had borders to cross and all kinds of policies. Yes. And so the growth theory essentially states that the more we have of shared information, the more information that's prevalent, we can all benefit. As always, feel free to ask me questions. My email is jkemper@southplainscollege.edu. You can also follow me at Twitter. My new Twitter account, it's still the same one. I just changed the username. It's Mr. Kemper, MrKemper. Thank you and have a nice day.